So I have the privilege to speak with Bill Bagatelas today. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you, Kimberly. Pleasure to be here.
I was wondering if you could give us a little bit about your background and also where you're based now and what you've been doing.
Kimberly, I've been in Central Europe for about 9 years. I've been teaching full-time for City University of Seattle in Bratislava and part-time for the University of New York in Prague, as well as the University of Northern Virginia in Prague and the Anglo-American University in Prague. I'm kind of a nomadic lecturer going back and forth. I've also taught at Central European University in Budapest as a visiting professor for 1 year. In addition, I've been doing a lot of research and publishing. I've published 6 co-edited books with an Italian economist named Bruno Sergi, and we've been focusing on everything from economic development to business strategies, business ethics, and how these impact development standards worldwide. Our main focus has been on Europe, and this year we're going to publish our 7th book on democracy and democracy building by the end of the year.
You have done extensive research on the wealth gap, the growing wealth gap in the United States, and what its implications are. Could you kind of give us your overview of what has been happening and why?
Well, as your viewers certainly are aware, we're facing a global financial crisis. And crisis certainly is a strong word, but it's not an exaggeration. And in my view, the reason we're facing the crisis is because the global wealth gap has grown in every society except Russia since the early 1980s. And in its simplest form, the wealth gap is caused by regressive or negative tax policies. Regressive here means any tax policy by government that dramatically lowers taxes on either the wealthiest people and or the wealthiest corporations and their profits. Once those tax rates come down dramatically in a regressive tax setting, then government debt starts to go up very quickly, and this has been happening around the world. Government debt has been growing in many countries as first the U.S. passed regressive taxation, and then Europe followed suit in the 1980s. After the U.S. began in 1981, Europe and then Asia followed suit. Now we see regressive tax structures in almost every country. So additionally, when taxes come down dramatically on the highest incomes, indirect taxes go up at the same time on the middle class. And this is where the problems begin, because most demand in the global economy comes from a middle class. So if middle class incomes are not rising with the living standard, if middle class incomes are not rising as fast as the cost of living, then all kinds of problems happen. The most important being that the average middle class person worldwide, especially in the U.S., starts to live on debt. And they start to use debt on a daily basis just to survive or to maintain their living standards. And the crisis we have today is caused by too much debt in the system. And so now it's going to take government intervention in the United States. The government will have to step in and purchase all this debt from the private sector. And this is almost unprecedented. It hasn't happened for about 20 years ago there was a similar event in the U.S., but the crisis right now is the greatest crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s.
And how is all of this tied into profits made by the military-industrial complex?
That's a very good question as well. I often wonder how many people, including Americans out there, have remember the famous speech, the first televised speech by a U.S. President, President Eisenhower, in 1961. Shortly before he left office, he warned the American people. He said, quote, "Beware, fear the military-industrial complex, because eventually the size of the military will grow to the point where the entire economy depends on military spending." So during the Cold War, we were told by all of our presidents that once communism is defeated, or at least contained, then the United States and NATO and the West can spend less money on the military. Well, perhaps they meant it at the time, but we've seen just the opposite. Military spending continues to grow. And obviously we have several forms of military conflict that require even more spending with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But in the case of the United States especially, no other country in the world literally as we speak, in a post-World War II context, is as dependent now on military spending to maintain economic growth as the U.S. is.
And you've been quite critical of the Bush administration.
Yes, I have. With all due respect to Mr. Bush and his administration, I don't mean this in a personal way, but I believe that the public needs to be told some very fundamental truths about economics. And the Bush administration, without question, has favored, through tax policy, the wealthiest 20% at both the private income level and the corporate profit level. So the Bush administration and their rhetoric not matching their reality has, I think, reached a point now where the world is looking at the Bush administration and asking some serious questions about how Americans view leadership, not only in financial matters or economic, but in larger social and ethnic areas, and even more importantly in terms of war and peace.
And what are your thoughts on the two presidential candidates?
Well, I'm personally for Mr. Obama. I believe Mr. Obama has the right kind of background to appreciate how most Americans are living today. In other words, Mr. Obama does not come from a privileged background. He struggled very, very hard in childhood. This is a self-made man. There are not too many people like that in the United States that go into politics.
And what about his policies on the economy?
For example, Kimberly, he's proposed a progressive tax. Now, he has not used the word progressive, but he has proposed raising taxes on the wealthiest groups in our country. I completely support this. How many people out there remember that after World War II, the United States and non-communist Western Europe, Japan, East Asia, they all instituted a progressive tax, literally every country. And economic growth was very solid. And until 1981, the progressive tax was in place. In the United States, there was a 70% tax, at least a 70% tax on highest income until 1981. The United States had a very minimal budget deficit, a yearly debt, and a very minimal government debt overall.
So what are your thoughts on John McCain?
John McCain, Kimberly, as a person, I have to say I respect him very much. However, I have to say that as his candidacy became more serious, once it became obvious he was going to be the Republican candidate, I became quite disappointed to hear him say that he would continue many of President Bush's policies. And one of his quotes was, "The Bush tax cuts must continue." At this point, I have to say that I'm still looking for the real John McCain. I feel like I'm seeing the McCain who wants to get elected. I don't know if I'm going to ever see the John McCain during the campaign who in 2002 co-sponsored the McCain-Feingold bill. He co-sponsored an important bill with now Senator Russell Feingold of Wisconsin, who was then a congressman. This was a bill, imagine the same John McCain 6 years ago, Kimberly, sponsoring a bill that would call for the elimination of major corporate contributions to American political parties and campaigns. The Republican Party is the party of corporate power. They depend on this. John McCain was, can you imagine that? I would imagine every other Republican woke up that night and stayed awake for the rest of the night. Now McCain's raising record levels of corporate money. And Kimberly, I have to go back to Obama for a moment. How many people out there realize that Barack Obama is the only presidential candidate in U.S. history, the only nominee of a political party to officially ban, not take any money from corporate lobbyists and corporate? This is unbelievable. And look at all the money he's raising. Where's it coming from? It's coming from basic, desperate Americans. Obama or McCain absolutely must convince the middle class that there are no new tax increases planned, either on direct income or indirectly. Once the middle class believes that, once they're convinced that their taxes will not increase, demand will start to grow. But the only way to do that, and history shows this, perhaps historians should become economists. Maybe that's the answer to the problem in economics here. The only way to do this is for the government to tax wealth. That is the only way. Not a sales tax on food, because that punishes everybody. Poor people, rich people, everybody have to eat. Not a sales tax on clothing. Only a direct tax on income. Income is the only thing that an income tax is the only kind of tax that separates different classes.
Okay.
So,
Thank you very much.
thank you, Kimberly. It's been a great honor and pleasure. I've enjoyed this thoroughly.